All right, let's just get into it. People will filter in and ask questions as we go. So first and foremost, I want to walk through the blog post. I'm going to answer a few of the questions around upgrading code mods, async request APIs, the instrumentation file, server actions, and I pulled some code, did a little demo, and we can talk through that as well. So Next.js 15 RC2, our last release was back in May for RC1, so it's been a few months, and we've really been focusing on stability, trying to patch up as many things that y'all found as you tested out Next.js 15 and some of the new changes we've made, and addressing some of the long-standing requests that we've had. So there's quite a few things actually jam-packed in here that we're going to talk through and do a demo of some of these as well. And if there's specific things you want to see me go into more or talk about a little bit more, please let me know in the chat. Got some folks tuning in from Brazil in the chat. Brazil mentioned. Nice. What is up? Hey, everybody. People on YouTube. Hey, YouTube in the chat. From the Netherlands, Brazil, Denmark, India. What is up? All right. So first and foremost, we take our commitment to upgrades really seriously, and we want to make it as easy as possible for y'all to go from Next.js 14 to Next.js 15. Small sidebar on the release strategy. So we follow semantic versioning, which means that when you go from Next.js 14 to Next.js 15, there is at least one breaking change. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything has changed and there's a whole new model that you need to think and rethink, like when we introduced the app router. Instead, it could be something as simple as, hey, there was this deprecated API that used to exist and is no longer in the core of Next.js. All of those breaking changes, we want to automate away with code mods and try to take as much of that work off your plate as possible. So this new code mod CLI that we've released, basically we'll just go through all of the possible code mods that could apply, and then you can pick which ones that you would like to run. And that'll help smooth out some of this process, not only for the Next.js changes, but also if you're upgrading to React 19 and you want to go through some of those changes as well. The code mod team, the team behind code mod, they have some helpful code mods, hence the name, to help with that process as well. So if you're going to try out Next.js 15, highly recommend to give this a shot. And if you want to see an example of what it looks like, I have this Next.js Commerce demo. It's a commerce app that is built with Shopify and all the latest things. And let me just zoom in a little bit here. This is an example of what the output's going to look like. So we're going to talk through this async request APIs change. Basically, params and search params are now async. So it's going to go ahead and just modify all of that code for you so that you don't need to make that change. Same thing with cookies and headers. These dynamic APIs that are reading from the incoming request are now asynchronous, which is going to be important later. And that's pretty much the bulk of this change. It was a relatively up-to-date repo, so it wasn't too hard to move from 14 to 15. We basically just have the changes for the async request APIs and changing cookies and so on and so forth. Also, since I was using some of the features in React 19 on the Canary channel before they were on the path to stability in React 19, one of those was use form state. And use form state has got a glow up with use action state. Probably the thing that I like the most is that there's a third option here for pending. So if previously you were using use form status to get the pending state to show a loading spinner, that's just now part of use action state. And the import changed as well. So the code mod is also going to change this for you with React 19, which is very nice. There was a couple instances of that in my application. That's pretty much it. It also updates the type. Now, just want to note, there's some kind of weird types right now while we're on these pre-release versions. But the goal is to have a stable release of Next.js 15 here very soon, very, very soon. So then you won't have to look at those, ugly pre-release versions. So that's coming soon. I also changed to nextconfig.ts, which we can talk through a little bit as well. So code mods from the CLI, big. Let me check on the chat. Touch on the client components are also rendered on the server. I can definitely talk about that. Client components pre-rendered and other questions. Grabbing params use client. Okay. Grabbing params in client components. Yep. I'm going to talk about that. Caching. Want to talk a little bit about caching? Definitely talk about server functions and server actions. I see a comment about that. We'll talk about this here, caching. Yeah. Talk about built-in auth. I don't know what you mean by that. But if you want to see an example of auth, I have a awesome SaaS template demo that I can walk through that you might be interested in. And yeah, we're going to talk about the form component as well. Okay, back to the blog post. Let's get into it. So the next thing, which is a pretty big thing, is that we are targeting stability for Turbopack for local dev. So Next.dev -- turbo. We're targeting stability for this in Next.js 15. We've been working on this for a while, and so many of y'all have given us great feedback, great bug reports, opened issues, helped us debug, sent us over trace files, so we can not only make it faster, make it use less memory, and work on the largest applications. And we've patched up a bunch of bugs since the first release. If you tried Turbopack in the past and it didn't work out for you, highly recommend giving it another shot, because we have fixed just so many different bugs that were some of those last edge cases that you might have ran into. So definitely give it another shot and let us know, because we're targeting a stable release here with Next.js 15. In the past couple months, we've not only reduced memory and also made it faster, but we're kind of just getting started here. There's so much more we want to do with a additional caching layer on top of Turbopack that we're cooking on right now that we'll share more later. So lots of speed improvements and memory usage reductions to come in the future as well. Also, this is just local dev. So we are also in parallel using that same core of Turbopack to handle production builds as well. So right now we're at about 96% of test passing for builds. If you remember this fun website, areweturboyet.com, we use this to track development process over the past year, let's call it. But really, we launched this. I guess it's been about a year since we launched this, and just slowly burnt down the. It was probably about actually I can look here. We had 5,700 tests at the time. And over the course of the year, we added about 1,000 more tests. So as we add more features, as you all report bugs, as we fix issues, every single one of those is getting tests, and it's hardening the core of Next.js, especially the newer things like the app router, where we're just getting more real world usage and making that just really, really stable. So now we've been at about 100% of test passing. And then for all new things we add, of course, also adding tests. We're doing the same thing for builds. So started out with basically nothing, but we were able to jump up to about 80% pretty quickly because of how much of the core we're reusing across builds and dev. And it'll be the same idea with the caching layer as well. We'll be able to have that unified module graph, and we're getting close, 96%. So pretty soon here, we'll put out a call for dogfooding and more testing of Turbopack for builds. We're not there yet. We're still dogfooding it internally. But soon. Let me pause, check the chat. Image improvements, yes. I can talk through that. Interceptors, that is something I can definitely talk about. Kind of sidebar, but we can talk about it. Middleware, interceptors. Yeah, actually, this is related to this because the question above it from Uwe on Twitch is, where do we do auth checks? I can talk about that. Server actions for GET requests, GET server actions. I see that in here a couple times. Form component, we're going to talk about that. Self-hosting, caching changes, we will talk about that as well. Yeah, okay. Back to the blog post. Async request APIs. This is one that I feel like, it's tough to do open source work sometimes when you want to share work in public and give context on PRs, but then don't yet have a time to like fully shape the story. So some of you might have already seen this before we released the post, and we're kind of a little confused at what we were trying to accomplish here, why we were adding in this change. So hopefully this blog post and my context here can help give a little bit more of the reasoning behind this. Basically, you can think about accessing search params like URL query params, the params in the route segments. So, something with a dynamic route segment, cookies, headers, all of these things that take information from the incoming request. Honestly, it kind of felt in my mind like these could have been asynchronous all along, because you would imagine when you have an incoming request, you kind of want to wait for some piece of content before you display it to the user, display it in your React component. But what we're trying to call out in this block is, rather than having to wait for everything, like traditional request response model, you get the entire response for the page and you send it back. What we're trying to build with Next.js is a much more granular version of that. And a lot of the stuff you've heard us talk about with caching and PPR, and then some other future experiments I can talk through a little bit here, are trying to blend these worlds of dynamic and static content and allow you to build components that are dynamic, that use information from the incoming request, that are locally scoped. If I have a component somewhere else that doesn't need that information, it would be great if I could cache that. It would be great if I could pre-render that and put it in the broader shell of the application. Just trying to take some of the good parts of server-side rendering and some of the good parts of static generation and pre-rendering and merge those together. So to help push us towards that path, this change is basically setting us up for that future. So while right now it's kind of a no-op in a lot of ways, and if you don't make this change, it temporarily is allowed that you can just continue using them synchronously, it is preparing us for the future caching model that we think that y'all are really gonna like. So for this one, highly recommend using the code mod that we provided. It's gonna take care of updating all of the places in your code base that use this. Just one command here. And let me know if you have other questions on this change, but hopefully it's a pretty easy migration and sets you up well for the future, kind of taking care of this now with the breaking change in a major release. Yes. Some talk on self-hosting, just checking the chat. We can definitely talk through that as well. I've got a awesome new repo that I made that I haven't really had a chance to talk through live. So let's add that on here. There was a question about, we'll get to that repo. I think that's pretty much all on async request APIs. If you want to see an example, I mentioned there was that Next.js Commerce repo that I've ran the code mod on that's already upgraded all this, so you can check that out. But give it a shot. Let me know how it goes, and would love to hear more. Okay, server actions, which was one of the things that folks were asking for on X. So we already talked through upgrades and code mods. Is there a strike through here? I don't think there's a strike through. We're gonna do this. So we already talked about that. We will talk a little bit more about how it relates to PPR and caching in a bit, but I still want to make its way through the blog post. Now let's talk about server actions. And one of the things that Theo had mentioned here, the periodic recalculation of IDs work? Let's talk through that. So server actions have been around in Next, not since we first introduced the app router, but pretty quickly after. And you can basically think about it as creating a portal from the client to the server. You have some client code, typically, and you need to talk to an API. And rather than manually creating that API endpoint, you can use server actions to basically automatically scaffold that for you and connect the dots or make a reference between the client and the server. Now, the best practices for making APIs still apply here. You should still have authorization checks to make sure that only people who have access to use the data or mutate the data inside of that action can still call that action. But we wanted to improve the security even further. This was a lot of the feedback that we heard when we first released these. So two of the things that we shipped, one was dead code elimination. So if you have a server action like this one that does not get used, it will not have a reference in the client bundle, meaning that the client has no idea that this code even exists on the server, and somebody can't try to manually make a request to that HTTP endpoint. The second is secure action IDs. So now we're generating these unguessable, non-deterministic IDs that the client uses to know how to make that reference to the server. That's how it makes the connection between I have a form or a server action that I need to call. It knows how to basically connect the dots between the two. These IDs get recalculated, and we're going to talk through exactly what that looks like. So first off, let me just go over to this code, and I want to talk through. Let's talk through this first. So I have this form. I don't know if this is too small. That's better. So I have this form in a client component, and it's using a server action. It's got an input with type of name. It's got a button to submit, and we call this server action. The server action takes in the form data, it gets the name, it logs it out. That's pretty much all it does. And then I also have this not used action that doesn't do anything. So if I go back here and I'm running with Turbopack, Next.js -turbo here, and I say Lee and I hit enter, down at the bottom left in the terminal, you will see the console output on the server from running this. So that's just a basic server action. But now let's talk about how those client references work. So I'm going to go here. We're going to stop our dev server. We're going to run a build, and we're going to inspect the output. Now, you don't need to do this. You don't necessarily need to worry about this. This is just something that Next.js is taking care of for you. So I ran a build, and if I go into the .next folder, we can see all of the generated files. You're going to see this .rscinfo file inside of the cache, and this cache is what's going to allow you to set a custom encryption key if you would like, or use an auto-generated encryption key, as well as a time when this encryption expires. So the default is going to be 2 weeks. Let me go ahead and actually just delete .next and run this again so you can see one of the auto-generated ones. Oh, well, it just popped up there when it refreshed. We'll do it again for good measure. Here is one of the auto-generated keys, encryption keys. And if I go to, well, now let me wait for this to finish. Go back to here. Let's go into our server, and then we're going to go to app, and then we're going to go to page. Now, inside of page, we have just a jumble of stuff. So I'm going to format this file. But I'm going to look in here for that reference. Where's that ID? So we have two different IDs. We have one ID that is for the not used action. Remember, this is server-side code. And then we have another ID that is used for the form action, the one that I'm actually using inside of my app. So now let me peruse over to the client code. Let's go static, chunks, app, page. Again, I'm gonna format this so we can make sense of the madness. And what you're gonna notice in here, just scroll to the bottom so you can see, there's only one server reference. So we only see one ID referenced here for CF. So this is the server action that we're actually using. The other one is dead code eliminated and not referenced in the client bundle. This is how the client knows how to make that connection back to the server here. So that's pretty nice. And if I try to manually make a request to go to that server action, that's where this encryption key comes in very handy. And if you would prefer not to use the default key because you're on a self-hosted setup, or you just want to kind of handle the encryption your own way, you want to handle the rotation of the keys your own way, one of the things you can do is go over to this section of the docs, which I can link, and it talks about overriding your encryption keys. Basically, you set this next server actions encryption key environment variable, and we're gonna do that. So let me go here, paste this in. We're gonna call this stream, and save that, and run a new build. And you're gonna see that instead of the value that we have here, now we have stream. So that's pretty nice. That's pretty nice. You have the full customization to handle that however you would like. If you want to dig more into this because you're the curious type, we also have this PR that shows how we create the server reference and how we hash and salt it periodically, shows that default time of 14 days, and goes a little bit more into the encryption. Again, if you want, you can override that if you would prefer. So pretty nice change. I'm pretty happy with this change. Let's see. Let me check out the chat. Why not make CSRF kind of protection? We have a really good server actions security. CSRF. There's a good section in here that talks a little bit about this. All server actions can be invoked by plain form elements, which could open them up to CSRF attacks. But behind the scenes, server actions are always implemented using post, and only this HTTP method is allowed to invoke them. This prevents most vulnerabilities, particularly due to same-site cookies being the default. Additional protection is that it compares the origin header to the host header, or x-forwarded for. If they don't match, the action will be rejected. So this is already kind of built in, and we're just hardening and improving the security story for server actions in this latest release. Is eliminating unused server actions for security purposes. Yeah, I think, ideally you don't want somebody to, accidentally create an endpoint that they use with use server. Then there's a reference to that endpoint on the client, which somebody can then make a request to, and you haven't put any proper authorization on that endpoint. Just as a reminder, you should still, inside of here, when you're talking to your database or you're talking to your auth provider, you would still want some check in here that is, if user is something, to check and make sure that they have the right permissions to actually make this mutation on the database. So all the best practices still apply to setting up your HTTP endpoints. Other questions? Let me check the chat. That's looking good. Okay. Oh, another thing that I haven't tried, but it should work. We're gonna find out live. Let's see if this works. Restarted my dev server. Okay, and I'm gonna say Lee. And maybe not. I'm trying to remember if this should just automatically show up here or not, but let's try. There we go. Okay, so you probably didn't realize it, but your React DevTools extension, it automatically updated. I mean, assuming you reload your Chrome or Chromium browser every now and then. I mean, I don't usually very often, but sometimes it auto reloads and it auto updates. And you might notice by this new icon here, it's not the emoji anymore. It's like a nicer icon. And it has support for server components. So if I do console logging inside of my server components, I can see it on the server. If I go look at my tree here, you can see things marked with server for server components. There's a bunch more to get into here. I should probably do a whole video on this, but really, really nice change to be able to better debug React server components and a lot of the new React features. So including partial pre-rendering. So that is a very welcome change. Excited to see that. We talked about this. We talked about this. Static route indicator. Let me pause and check chat really quick. What IDE am I using? I'm using NeoVim. Love my NeoVim setup. Thank you. Okay, I'll keep rocking and rolling. The chat's active today. Shout out to the chat. Y'all are having a good time. Static route indicator. This is just a nice little win. We've been really working to try to add more dev tools and more hints in Next.js to help you understand what's happening. And if your route can be, statically pre-rendered, we want to show that while you're working so that you have a sense of what's happening in your application. This is just the start of our dev tools journey, and we want to do a lot more here. But this is the same thing, just for context. When you run builds, we have the output at the end of the build that shows this little table that has a key, whether things are static or dynamic. So static is the circle, and you can see this one's dynamic and these ones are static. So that's just a nice little win there, which you can disable this if you want. If you click X, it will persist that as well in your to local storage if you don't want to see that on your in your session. Okay, form component. How we doing on time? Doing good on time. We're making our way through some of these. Form component. The form component basically is a thin wrapper. No, it's a nice extension of the normal HTML form component that will do prefetching and client-side navigation for you. So this is one of those things where I feel like if you need this, you know that you need this component. And if you don't, then you're probably fine. Just continue building forms the way you were, or doing mutations the way you were. I can give you a pretty good example of this, which is Next.js Commerce. So when I search here and I do cup, for example, I want to immediately client-side transition to the route. And in this case, I'm also showing the loading state when I go there. So let me say shirt. And by loading state, I mean loading.tsx. The reason why this is really powerful is, obviously that seems fine on fast internet. But if I'm doing slower internet, let's do 3G here, and we'll say shirt. Even though it's slow, I get that immediate transition on the client to the loading indicator with suspense. And then I wait for my server component to fetch information, in this instance from Shopify, and finish out the results here. This is using the form component. If you want to check out the code base for it, it's all open source. And that's just a quick demo of how that works. It's pretty simple, but it's kind of a small improvement on the native HTML form. Question in the chat, can we override the token rotation logic for server actions? Yes, you can. There was an environment variable that you can use. I can put links down below, or if you search in the docs for it, hopefully you should find it. But yes, you can do that. Next, support for nextconfig.ts. This is honestly, a major quality of life improvement. I love having this. It's we're starting to get to a world where we have all TS files in the tree, and with Tailwind v4, we can possibly ditch that post CSS file, ditch our config file if you're just going with vanilla tailwind. So I'm looking forward to that. I think it's going to be great. There's some caveats here. Mostly everything is supported, but there's still some gotchas around ESM, CJS to note. So if you run into something, please let us know. We can get it patched up before we do a stable release, but hopefully it should be working pretty well. Instrumentation. There was a question about this one as well. Theo asked to see a demo of this. This file is something that we've been working on with some of our partners in the observability and monitoring space, folks who work with things like OpenTelemetry. And in particular, we've been collaborating with Sentry on this on-request error hook. So this file allows you to, one, run some code on server startup, which is this register API, but also now has this on-request request error hook, which other providers can build on top of when building observability tools for Next.js, or you can build your own custom things. So one of the ideas from Theo here, which I thought was funny, that I just went ahead and did was, an example of using instrumentation to page someone would be dope. So I said, okay, I'm going to build this. I did it last night just for fun. So let's take a look at what that looks like. I'm going to go to my instrumentation TS file, and let's dig in here. Okay. So let me actually start down at the bottom. I have on request error, and we grab that type from up top. It has the error, the request, and then some additional context. So I'm getting the error message in stack. I'm basically formatting this nice little object here that has all the information that I need. And then I'm triggering a PagerDuty alert that says there was a critical error in my application. So if we go back up to here, this function we could customize in a bunch of different ways. I'm only running this when we do production builds. Otherwise, you're going to light up your PagerDuty instance when you're running locally, which I was doing at first just for fun, just to feel something. But now that it's ready for production, I'm going to add that check-in. Honestly, setting up PagerDuty was super easy, by the way. So shout out to their team for making this process and onboarding really easy. But all I had to do was copy a code snippet basically for their API call, take this routing key and put it in my .env file, and then make this fetch to the API endpoint and forward along some information. So for example, if I go back to this page, what I did is kind of a double whammy here, is not only showing the async request APIs, if you wanted to see an example of that, if the query string is not equal to valid, we're going to error out with, oh no. And we can do this by, again, doing a production build and starting our production server. While that's running, just to show quickly what this looks like. Here was one where I was running it locally just to kind of see what it looks like. I get all this context of what the stack is. This was triggered, assigned to me. My pager goes off. You can see what the urgency is. I can tag in my team. And then down below, this is where we get all the custom details that we can forward along. So looks like this came from server components for the app router. Here's some of the headers and things that we wanted to forward along. And then here's kind of that full stack trace. So you can set up kind of a lightweight error reporting tool using this, which I think is pretty nice. So let's go to here, and we're going to do query equals oh no. And that's going to throw an error, which is going to call my phone. So I'm getting a call from PagerDuty. It says, hey, you need to fix your stuff. And now I can go in and acknowledge that. So let's go over to here and see what this looks like. Okay, so we have a request triggered, Next.js request error, oh no, created at 109. And yeah, it's pretty much the same stack trace as before. So honestly, pretty nice to set up, pretty easy to use. PagerDuty, good onboarding, so shout out to them. Not too bad. I just realized now, like watching my replay back, my phone screen was totally blurred from my camera, but I think you got the idea. You understand what I'm doing. let me check in on the chat. Some people just tuning in. What's up? Thanks for hanging out. We're talking about the Next.js 15 RC2 release, or the release candidate. I don't have an example of using this with Axiom, but should be just as easy to integrate with. Axiom is another great tool for observability. Will the stream be able to watch later? Yes, it'll replay automatically on X, YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitch, and everywhere we're streaming. Can we change environment variables on runtime without rebuilding the app? Yeah, absolutely. So one thing you can do, well, depends on what your definition of an environment variable is. So there's the built-in .env file, which gets bundled as part of building your application for production. But in my self-hosting example, one really common thing I hear from a lot of people is that they want to integrate with something like HashiCorp Vault or 1Password and like fetch some secrets and then expose them in their application some way. I just did a very hacky version of this here, again, using the instrumentation file and the register function, which runs code on server startup. But you could imagine doing something like this to fetch dynamic runtime values and use them throughout your application. Did I have instrumentation JS in my app? Was I a liar? I had TS. I see somebody mention that here. Question about ESLint. We'll talk about that. Okay. I think that's all in the chat for now. Should you do Next.js 15 RC2? Absolutely. Give it a shot. Give it a shot and let me know how it goes. Are serverless servers sharing the same register call? That is a good question. I actually am not sure, but I can definitely find out. Is this a public repo? This one is a public repo. The code that I have locally is not. I'm happy to push this up if you think that would be beneficial. Okay, let's fly through some of the last things in the blog post, and then we can talk about some of the other FAQs that y'all had, including PPR and caching. Yeah. There's a couple other just nice kind of quick wins here. Some improvements around server components and hot module refresh. You can kind of reduce making additional calls by HMRing those fetch requests, and you can turn that off, of course, if you want. Just doing static generation of pages, so pre-rendering is going to be faster with this change, which is nice. You can have more granular control over it, including how many times there are retries, what the maximum concurrency is, and so on and so forth. This was a common request we had from people who are really kind of extending Next.js past the bounds of statically generating a lot of pages. Self-hosting. Let's talk about self-hosting. So in case you missed it, I published this video. It is a 45-minute tutorial walking through everything you need to know about self-hosting, kind of just in general, some things to think through with a VPS, dedicated servers, how you scale that up, what are some of the trade-offs, but also has this demo repo that shows how you customize pretty much everything in Next.js if you want to when hosting on a container or multiple containers. So that is, I'll just pull up this demo. That's things like image optimization, data fetching, streaming with server components, and talking to a database, ISR, and overriding caching headers, middleware, environment variables, all this stuff. So if you want to see a pretty comprehensive demo of all of those features, as well as a video, please check that out and let me know how it goes. Two of the things that I highlight in that video that we recently improved in the Next.js 15, one is around cache control. So not only do you have basically full control over caching headers now, whether you want to set them in your headers in your next config, or you want to define them through this expire time value in next config as well. We've also updated the defaults to have better compatibility with more CDNs kind of out of the box. So that's a big win for self-hosters, and also image optimization. So previously we were basically recommending that you should use Sharp. It was not required, but kind of strongly recommended because it's going to manage memory a little bit better than the previous WebAssembly based version with Squoosh. But now we kind of have the best of both worlds. So we'll automatically install Sharp for you when you're using Next Start or standalone output mode. And yeah, just a couple nice improvements here to make the self-hosting experience easier. If there's other things you want to see here, definitely let us know. I think that will hopefully address some of the big pain points around self-hosting. There's another one here, which I can kind of just bump up and we can talk about right now, which is interceptors and middleware. There's kind of two different things to talk through here. The first, let me just bump back over to here. We're going to start with this Next.js starter app, which is another repo that I made about a month ago that is a kind of SaaS starter kit that's built on Next.js 15. It actually, I've already updated it to RC2, so if you want to go check out this code base, it's updated as well. Uses Postgres, Drizzle ORM, works with Stripe, all open source, all using the latest patterns. And one thing on this application was that we wanted to not only kind of use all of the best patterns, but also have this playground to show how all of these features work. So going back to here, one of the things we were talking about with middleware was where do you do auth checks and why is running middleware with the Node.js runtime a common question for self-hosters? So in this app, I'm actually using middleware in what I believe to be the canonical way of how you should use it for authentication, which is you shouldn't talk to your database in middleware. I think the name, maybe this was naming's hard. Maybe this was not the right name for middleware in Next.js. You can kind of think about it as that global, very lightweight bit of code that's programmatically running before potentially every single route in your application or every single request, even to static assets. So going to talk to your database, which potentially is not in the same location, if you're self-hosting, it still is, but do you really want to block every single request in your application to do that? Maybe, maybe not. What Next.js is trying to do here is put some guardrails in place to help you get the best performance and also, honestly, structure your app for the best security. Ideally, you want to place authorization checks close to where the code that's consuming it is. So whether that's reading in a page or doing a mutation in an action, and you're effectively building this data layer inside of your Next.js application. So the canonical example here that I'm doing is you're still doing an authentication check, but you're checking a cookie. It's very lightweight, it's very fast. It's allowing me to quickly redirect to a sign-in route if they're not signed in. Otherwise, just continue on and refresh the session. So I'm basically resetting the cookie here or updating the cookie. And the authentication example in this repo is, I think, as simple as you can possibly get. It is rolling your own auth, even though it's still using popular libraries for cryptography and handling passwords, but it's using user password login. So hopefully is a kind of simple example to kind of understand the auth concepts and also how to use middleware. Now, the reason why I wanted to give this whole kind of background on middleware first is because when I talk to people about, hey, I want to use the Node.js runtime for middleware when I'm self-hosting, because they're trying to use something like Prisma or an ORM or some kind of database tool, just talking to Postgres directly in middleware. And most of the time, that's probably not what you want to do. You probably do not want to directly connect to your database in that file, which is some of the reasons why we had that constraint in the first place. Now, there are some instances where this is not true, where you're just trying to use some package and it just doesn't work in the more constrained runtime that middleware uses. And that is exactly the thing that we're wanting to fix for, which is why we will be adding support to run all of middleware in Node.js. But I like to highlight this first part first because most of the time, the use cases that I hear, I just want people to do auth correctly. So I don't want them to just immediately pull for database.select and slow down every single request in their application. So I would still highly recommend doing the data layer approach. The kind of pair to this that we're also exploring and we'd love your feedback on is called interceptors. Which we have a RFC kind of PR here if you want to learn a little bit more about it. You can kind of think about this as a complement to middleware. There will be differences between the two, but this is something where you can do some of your kind of control flow in a nested file system based way inside of your application. So if you are trying to protect the dashboard segment of your application, like everything /dashboard and under, you can put this interceptor at that level in the file system and do your checks to redirect or go to a 404 or say not authorized. And we're going to add, or potentially going to add, a not authorized function as well here. So would love your feedback on this as well. We're definitely exploring some of the options here to make this better. I know that thread and that request has been going on for some time, but we definitely hear y'all and want to make that better. So I will pause, see if there's questions on anything I said there. What if you were using session-based auth? That is totally fine. You can use whichever you would prefer. In this instance, I am setting sessions through cookies, so not database sessions. Yeah. Will interceptors work with route groups? I would assume so, but we're still kind of in the RFC stage. But yeah, I would assume that would work. Could we get more dev indicators? I know there is the new static and dynamic thing, but stuff like unstable cache logs, why a page is dynamic, why is it static? Yeah, absolutely. We want to make more and more dev tools to help y'all out. One thing to note is that we do have this logging config option when you're running in development mode. So Next.dev, you can do logging full fetches or logging fetches full URL true, and that's going to give you more information on anything that's interacting with the cache locally. Note this is only in dev though as well. The docs don't say anything about the runtime. What does Next use for Vercel for middleware? So the default runtime, whether you're self-hosted or whether you're using Next.js on Vercel, everything is Node.js. And then if you're using middleware specifically, that is the more limited runtime that we call the edge runtime that is trying to be a subset of Node.js. CanStack, router, dev tools are amazing. Yeah, they are really nice. We would like to get some dev tools similar to that. Long time Next builder, 5+ years in the chat. Hey, that's awesome. Thanks for sticking around. Next.js Vercel team, how are we thinking about longevity and its plan? How do we think about updates, more stability, similar to the Go ecosystem? Yeah, I had a similar question to this on the X platform yesterday because they were asking about, and I've seen this sentiment shared quite a bit. It's like, oh my gosh, Next.js 15, why another major release? Like, can we please stop with the major releases? And I really want to stress that a major release, while hopefully we have as few of breaking changes as possible, major release with semantic versioning should not mean rewrite my whole application, everything's changed, throw it out and start over from scratch. I think everyone has these kind of horror stories or tales of Python 2.3, Angular changes, and they think that every major change necessarily means there's going to be some drastic shift. But Next.js has tried to follow semantic versioning as best as possible, which means more, obviously we're on, V15 here, which means more major versions, but we want to keep that upgrade process as easy as it can be and provide code mods to kind of smooth that out. So we definitely really care about that. And going forward, you'll probably see us cut a lot more minor releases to try to get these updates out more quickly without having to wait to have this big release for some big moment. We want to try to make that process as smooth as possible. Other questions? Middlewares run for static assets. By default, if you specify nothing, middleware will run in front of every single request in your application. Now the docs, by default, kind of give you this matcher that will say, hey, what do you want to run on? And I believe the default copy pasta here is probably like something of what you want. Only run on everything except for APIs, static files, image optimization, the favicon, like stuff like that. And you can kind of tweak this regex as necessary. Is Next.js 15 going to be out before React 19? So Yes. So Next.js 15 is not strictly dependent on React 19. If you're using the pages router, you can continue using React 18. We kind of decoupled that release to make the process upgrade a little bit smoother for pages router folks. If you're using the app router, we use the canary channel of React. So it's kind of React 19 plus, basically. So you're not having to worry about handling that version yourself. It's a vendored version inside of the app router. I think I made it through the chat up until now. Is Next.js RC2 compatible with Next auth? It will work. There will be a console log about the cookies headers change, and the Next auth team, the PR might already have been merged, but should be merged within the next week to cut a new release that has the async request APIs change. Is the React compiler stable yet in Next.js? It is not. It's still experimental, but worth checking out. Other questions? Is Next.js a backend solution? Is Next.js as a backend solution limited in some way? I don't think so. I mean, it kind of depends on how your team operates. If you are a solo dev and you're just trying to build a full stack app, I think Next.js is great for building full stack app, and you can kind of build your data layer. I keep mentioning data layer, by the way, and I think we have some good docs around this. Data access layer. Let me see if I can. Data access layer. Yeah, so in our authentication docs, we talk a little bit about a data access layer. I think that there's a pretty compelling case of building your whole app inside of Next.js for some teams. Now, a lot of teams just can't operate that way. They have a massive API that another team works on that they're not going to rewrite in Next.js, and that's fine. You can still call your APIs. You can still have separate services. That's totally okay. I think this is targeted more for the solo builders, for the indie hackers, for the side projects, for the hobby projects. And maybe over time, as people gain more confidence with it, they'll continue to push that boundary for larger and larger applications. What we've seen from a lot of customers who are kind of starting greenfield apps from scratch, so like AI apps is usually the most common thing right now. A lot of them are choosing to just build it all in Next.js. And then when they're ready to kind of extract that logic out and use it elsewhere, if you have your data access layer and it's being consumed by your server actions, you can also just call those same functions inside of a route handler. And now you've exposed public APIs that a mobile app could use or other apps or other sites could use. So that's one option. Of course, there's trade-offs, right? Like if you're going to have a team of 50 people working on your API only, you might want to have that as a separate service. So if I'm using App Router, if you're using App Router, the React version is vendored to the Canary version, the Canary channel. Pages Router, it is not. Pages Router, you can continue using whichever version you want. When will Vercel Blob be out of beta? Hopefully soon. We're making some improvements to it right now, but we'll hopefully be out of beta soon. I'm using it for the music player that I built, which is kind of fun. This is another open source repo that I recently published. It's a Next.js 15 app. It's got some good stuff. And it's even got these like clickable inputs, which is kind of fun. Click in here. And it uses blob for these images. So if you want to look at a blob example, check out that code base. Unstable cache, we can talk about that. Is there anything planned to organize middleware? So what I was talking through with interceptors is kind of a similar idea there. Is rather than having one large middleware file, interceptors can be more granular, file system based, and you can have multiple of them that can compose together. Okay, let's go back to here and see how we're doing. Let's talk about how does it relate to PPR and caching in terms of the async request APIs. I've probably got I can probably go for about 20 more minutes. We'll see. And to do that, I have this page that I think would be an interesting example. So let me stop the dev server here and I'm going to open up this. Okay. So I have this component, /IO in my app, and I'm making a fetch request to get the time from this API. This could be any data, but I'm just doing this because it's very obvious when it changes. And I get back the JSON, and then I render it out. Now, one of the big improvements in Next.js 15 that y'all asked for, was to not cache the fetches by default. And that change is live in the Next.js 15 RC if you want to test it out. But as we got feedback from people building with Next.js 15 and adopting partial pre-rendering, we started to notice a common theme, which is that a lot of folks were conflating caching and pre-rendering. And it's kind of same, but different. Like they're related, but definitely two separate concepts. So let me show an example of this. When I'm running in dev, I'm reloading and getting fresh data on every reload. So I reload and I'm getting new information about the time. Actually, this could be a good time to do, let's do change in experimental. Oh wait, no, it's not experimental. It's logging, full fetches, full URL, true. Okay. Just because I mentioned this, it could be a good time to show this off. Okay, so see down here, I see we have a get to /IO at 200. It makes a get to world time API, and it does not cache. Reload, not cached. Awesome. Okay, now let me run a build, and let's talk through the production behavior. So now you might be thinking, okay, Next.js 15 fetch is not cached by default. Great. I'm going to run a production build. I'm going to go to this page. We're going to see a fresh time on every reload. So I run a build. I run a start. I go over here, and I'm reloading the page, right? Reloading the page. The date does not change. Now, for my astute viewers in the chat, why is this? Why is the date not changing on the right, even though it was not cached? We changed the caching behavior in Next.js 15. I'll let you all think for a second. Are the same requests between page function and generate metadata still deduplicated? Yes, we still have request memoization, which will happen automatically for fetch. And if you would like to do it for database calls using an ORM, you can use the React cache function, which effectively does that. Honey McFunny is correct. So when you do a build, Next.js is going, and has since Next.js 9, is going to try to statically optimize as much as possible. And in the current version of Next.js, the feedback we got from folks was, great, we're not caching fetch anymore. My mental model is that I reload the page and I get a new time, right? But there's pre-rendering, which is separate from caching. So this gets pre-rendered to a static page, and you can even see up here the static icon. We can see right here, this was turned into a static page. So, our team has spent a lot of time thinking about this. How do we get the mental model that people want out of caching and pre-rendering without having to juggle a bunch of different configuration options or, read a manual or just struggle with fighting against the framework? And this relates to PPR. This is why PPR is still experimental. This is why we've been taking all the feedback from Next.js 15, from PPR, from our own internal dogfooding and testing, and trying to find a model that really makes sense here. So I see some folks in the chat saying we could import cookies or headers. We can pull in missing dynamic. And you're right. What we could do is give Next.js some signal that, hey, this page is actually dynamic. And you might have seen things like export const, not runtime, export const dynamic equals force dynamic. Or you might have seen no store or cookies or headers, all these things. What we're trying to do is just put the right signals heuristics in Next.js such that it can figure that out for you. I did await fetch. Like, I probably want that to be dynamic. So one of the things we're working on, this is extremely experimental. It will probably not work if you try it out. So just go with me on a journey here. I'm trying to explain the rationale, but this is still very early. We have an experimental flag for a thing called dynamic IO. And the name kind of implies what it sounds like. Dynamic IO, input output, should make the application dynamic. And for good measure, while we're here, I'm going to turn on PPR as well. So let's go run another build. We'll go back to here. I'm not going to change anything in my code. I'm just going to have this. And you're going to notice, whoa, we got some build errors. Now, again, this is experimental. We're going to clean all this stuff up. But basically, the gist of what it's saying is, hey, you did some dynamic stuff that was not cached, and you also didn't use a suspense boundary. So which way, Western man? Like, what do you want to do here? Do you want this to be cached, or do you want it to be dynamic? And you kind of got to think about that choice. I could, for example, say, you know what? Rather than do this, I want to have suspense, and we're going to call time. And we could say there's, maybe in this instance, we'll just do fallback null. We could do this. And then also, just to make this build pass and just to show what it looks like, we also had this page completely unrelated to the demo that I'm showing, but just to show you, you could also do loading.tsx and do export default function. I can't type. Export default function. God. Yeah, return loading. Oh my gosh. So you could also do that. Doesn't really matter for this demo because we're not even using that page. But now let me run this again. In the build should pass, I think, hopefully. We've given Next.js the signals like, hey, you've said, by the way, when we're doing the pre-rendering of the page, because remember with partial pre-rendering, Next.js is going to try to pre-render up to the suspense boundaries. So it hits the suspense boundary and it's like, wait, you said that this thing inside of there was dynamic code, right? So now when I reload the page, I'm getting fresh dates on every time. And it might like be completely not dazzling of a demo. It's like, yeah, Lee, that's how I expected it to work from the start. But I really think that this model is going to be a lot better for folks. It's taken a while for us to kind of figure out the right heuristics for this. But hopefully this is more in line with what y'all had expected for caching and dynamic code. There's more stuff coming here, of course. I can just kind of put some cliffhangers here or some foreshadowing. I can just drop a use cache. Maybe that'll do something. I don't know. Will this do anything? I don't know. Let's find out. So let's say, for example, I didn't want this to be dynamic and I actually did want to cache this. You might have seen a function that looked like unstable cache previously. And what we're trying to do next is figure out a better version of this. So now you notice when I reload, it's cached. Reload as much as I want. This is unstable cache on steroids. This is, again, super experimental, super early, not ready to be dog fooded, not ready for anything. But I just want you to know we're really thinking about this, and we'll have more to share soon on how we make this experience better. But I'm getting really excited about the model that we're heading towards with Next.js. I'm sure there's going to be like a billion jokes about use cache, just another one of the use things. But yeah, that's just a little bit more context kind of on where we're headed. Hopefully that answers this. Let's see what the chat says. How is loading TSX different from a normal suspense inside of a page? It's not. So it's basically the exact same thing. Loading is just automating putting the suspense boundary for you. And the component that you render is the fallback. Wouldn't suspense make the page dynamic anyway? Suspense does not make the page dynamic. Suspense is how you're marking your, I'm speaking in the partial pre-rendering world here. It's how you're marking the holes. Like you define the shell of your application, and then suspense, you render or you pre-render up to those suspense boundaries so that you can build as much statically as possible. And then you're giving Next.js these signals. It's kind of binary. Do I want to cache it or do I want to run it dynamically, basically? Other questions? Does suspense make a component client side? It does not. Don't tell me you're using Vim. I am. I'm sorry. I've been sucked in. Another question on the IDE. Do I think TRPC is better than using server actions? Personally, I think that if you're using the app router, server actions, server components, you probably don't need TRPC in Next. If you're using Pages router, I think it's still a good choice. Other questions? Can you share a quick 2-line explanation for what dynamic IO is? Missed the first few minutes. Basically, the idea with dynamic IO is it's an extension of our research into partial pre-rendering and caching and trying to find a better model that more matches developers' intuition for how data fetching and caching should work in Next.js. Still experimental, probably will have tons of bugs, not ready to be dog-footed yet, but just wanted to start kind of putting our thought process out there of how we're thinking about this research. Yeah. Okay. I can probably go for a little bit longer. So if you have questions, drop them in the chat and I'll talk through some of these remaining things. We already talked about self-hosting. We talked about auth and we talked about the SaaS template demo. Quickly on server functions. So one of the things in React that they recently did was kind of rebrand and create this umbrella term of server functions, which is the parent of server actions. So a server action is a server function. And kind of what that implies to me is that it's creating space for other server function-like things in the future. So a server action, for example, is a post. There might be a Git-like server function in the future, which could be useful for some other things. So that is really the whole scope of server functions, server actions. Server actions still exist. You can still call them server actions. This is more of just creating that top level category. So we have the vernacular, we have the terminology to call it. Yeah. Grabbing params in client components. I believe there's an example. Let's see. Over in the upgrade guide, in the async request APIs, we talk through the recommended usage. It just as a reminder as well, like temporarily that you can still do it the same way. So if you don't have time when you're upgrading and you don't want to run the code mod for some reason, you can continue to use it this way. We don't recommend that. Please try the code mod, and if it doesn't work, let us know. But we know that sometimes you have bigger fish to fry, so that still works in Next.js 15. But down below, let me see. I think there's an example in here somewhere. Well, this isn't a client component. Oh, yeah, here we go. I was looking for use client, but I couldn't see it. So before, we had the params and search params that were passed as props to a client component. As a reminder, you can still do use params or use search params if you prefer to use the hook version of those. But now, one of the things that this is giving you is still the ability to synchronously access those promises using the use hook. If you haven't seen the use hook before, it allows you to unwrap a promise. So you pass it a promise that you haven't awaited, and then inside of your client component, you can unwrap that and use the value. So we're using params, we're using search params, and we can use them inside of here. The reason you might, most of the time, you're probably going to use the asynchronous usage of these, so this probably won't happen very often, but just wanted to mention that since that was asked about. I see, should I use form state or use form status or use action state? It's a good question. I think we linked in here to the React 19 changes. So you'll never need to use form state again. There's use action state, which is a replacement for it. And the code mods that we shipped include React 19 code mods that will help with that upgrade. The use form status hook also has new things on it, which is kind of nice based on feedback. There's still places where you might want this, but honestly, most of the time, I pretty much can just get by with using use action state for pretty much everything. So yeah. Will we be supporting Dino 2 at some point? So Dino 2 does work with Next.js now. They have support for Node.js compatibility. So that is one thing to check out. Is there a plan for type-safe navigation? We do have this experimental flag type routes, which gives you statically typed links. If you're doing like href/blog on a Next.js link component, it's going to give you type safety there. This is still experimental, but if that's something that you feel strongly about, maybe worth checking out. Checking the chat. Is another question again on React 19 and Next.js 15 and their relation. So Next.js 15 is not dependent on the React 19 release. It will likely go stable before the React 19 release. Would you use the new Next.js form or should you use the React form stuff? This is a good question. They can be used together. So this form component, which by the way works in the pages and app router, you can still use this in a client component with server actions, so with use action state or others. However, like it's kind of not really the main use case here, because the main use case is where you're navigating to a route kind of similar to a traditional HTML form. So you're navigating to /search and then you're appending those values. If you're just going to pass it a function for the action, a server action, you probably don't need to use form. How would you invalidate the cache with the new directive? You would still use revalidate tag or revalidate path. And there's also a companion function to add tags as well. Yes, we do plan on more dev tools. Are the docs available for... I'm not sure what that's in reference to, which docs, but let me know which docs you would like to see there. Everything I've mentioned so far today that is in the Next.js 15 RC2 release is on the Canary docs here. So if you click Canary here, you can view all of those. Will ShadCN and NextForm complement each other? So one thing ShadCN form does right now is it uses React hook form. Personally, I have found that to be overkill for my needs in building this SaaS starter app, which I'll just make, classic little email here, make an account. Inside of here, these are all forms. So like inviting a team member, this is a form, this is a form. All of this, it has client-side validation with HTML attributes and then also server-side validation with Zod. This is using ShadCN components, ShadCN UI, but I'm not using React hook form. So this could be an interesting example to dig into. If I'm using React Query, can I use basically the default Next.js caching revalidation tools? Yep, absolutely. Is there plans for an alternative Next.js that uses Vite instead of Turbopack? Nope, we're focused really on Turbopack. I think we've talked to the Vite team. We've kind of explored what some of those things could look like, and definitely still open to chatting with their team more. It's a non-trivial amount of work as well, and we did a pretty extensive deep dive into what it would look like to support Vite when we first set out on a journey to build Turbopack. We didn't just build it because we felt like it. There was a real need we needed in our application to replace Webpack, and didn't feel like Vite was matching the needs for that at the time. we have a pretty good GitHub discussion link that Tim posted, Tim Nutkins. If you check his Twitter and search for Vite, should be able to find it. That goes in more depth about why we picked it. And we're going to have a blog post about Turbopack soon. It goes a little bit more in depth about all this stuff. So stay tuned for that. Why is it not possible to set cookies in server pages render functions inside of dynamic routes? Good question. This is definitely a common one. By the way, if you go to nextjs.org/docs/app, we have some FAQs for the app router, which I've tried to curate for things that I get quite a bit. Also, you can always ask V0 about this. So which we'll just read from the Next.js docs. It always has context of all the latest docs. So let me find, where did that question go? Here we go. LinkedIn. For some reason, it doesn't say your name on LinkedIn, but thank you, LinkedIn user in the chat. I'll just ask the question here and let's gut check it and make sure that this is the right thing. Does Next.js, with dynamic IO, is suspense required? With that experimental flag, you have to choose either dynamic. I want my code to be dynamic and I need to consider my fallback states, my suspense boundaries, or I can make it cached. Okay, why is it not possible to set cookies in a pages render versus dynamic routes? This is due to the timing of when cookies are set and read. So server components execute in a separate module system from client components. Cookies is a dynamic function in Next.js that can only be known at request time, like the headers and search params. If you use cookies, that will opt your whole route into dynamic rendering. In the context of dynamic routes, the function is executed to generate the HTML. Okay, here we go. Now we're getting into like the meat of it. At this point, the response headers, including set cookie, so just normal HTTP, have already been sent to the client. Cookies are typically set as part of the HTTP response headers, and once they're sent, it's not possible to modify them or add new cookies during the same request response lifecycle. So if you had a nested suspense boundary on your page, you had some component, 5 layers down, you wouldn't be able just to arbitrarily set a cookie inside of that component and have it work as you would expect, because you need to set those cookies in the request, in that first request. So this is kind of a quirk of streaming, which we think streaming is a good enough trade-off for this change. But the recommendation here is to use set a cookie in a server action, in middleware, or in a route handler for these use cases. Hopefully that answers your question. V0 is probably better at answering it than myself. So if you have more questions, that's the place. Why is my editor theme white? I'm on system theme, so right now I'm on light mode. But I switch it up sometimes. I like dark mode too. They're both good. Okay, last couple questions. What is my Chrome blank tab extension? I am using Glean because it's what we use at Vercel. On my personal machine, I literally have an extension called Chrome blank new tab. I don't know why, it just feels clean in my brain. I think we talked about pretty much everything here except for this last one of client components pre-rendered, which I really don't need to say too much here because, let's see, because Dan Abramov has a really, really helpful post here. I can just put it in the chat, see if that works, that has some nice visualizations that basically explain, wait, client components still get pre-rendered? Client components are still included in that initial response. And the helpful way for me to think about it is that everything in Next.js prior to the introduction of server components was client components, basically. So everything was pre-rendered. Everything ran on both the server to pre-render it and then include a bundle in the client, include a script tag for that client component. But then there was also this introduction of, hey, the server tree. And the server tree can do a bunch of other really cool stuff like running only on the server. So this is a nice little demonstration of this. Worth checking out. Okay. I think that wraps up everything we wanted to talk through today with the Next.js 15 RC2 release post. We did a quick little demo, some of the features, answered some of your frequently asked questions on socials, on X, on YouTube, Twitch, LinkedIn. Thanks to everybody tuning in for today. This was a fun one. This is a good one. Lots of good stuff coming in this Next.js 15 release, and we're pretty close to a stable version. So stay tuned for that, as well as some of the experimental flags I talked about, some of the things that we're cooking on to improve the caching model, the rendering model, just the mental model of how to work with the app router. I'm really happy with where we're headed towards, and I think it's going to resonate with you all as well. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it for today. Thanks, Eminem. Yeah, thank you, Eminem. Shout out to Eminem. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Please let me know on X what you'd like to see in the next stream, and check out the repos that I mentioned during the stream on my GitHub at github.com/LeeRob. We've got the SaaS starter, the music app, the self-hosting example if you want to dig more into that. And yeah, have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I will see you in the next